Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old trail of dust into a darker room than history usually allows. In the cold hush of a museum vault, a clay tablet rests under soft light, and the marks pressed into it seem less like writing than footprints left by something that did not belong entirely to the human world. On one side of this story stand the Watchers who were meant to observe and not touch. On the other stand giant offspring, impossible teachers, and kings who seem to arrive from heaven, already carrying the weight of cities in their hands. If this kind of slow, strange history is your favorite way to end the day, like the video and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. Now let the room grow dim. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing become easy and slow. And let us step carefully into the oldest part of the memory. If you were standing here with me, the first thing you would notice is the temperature. Museum air has a peculiar honesty to it. It is cool in a way that tries not to disturb anything. It does not smell alive. Exactly. It smells of paper, old glue, cleaned glass, dust that has been persuaded to behave, and clay that has outlived all the hands that once knew how to read it. Somewhere beyond the room, very soft footsteps come and go. A distant door closes. The sound is so gentle it feels almost embarrassed to exist. And there, under the careful light, lies the beginning of our problem. The Book of Enoch is late, compared with the age it claims to remember. That matters. It also does not make the story less eerie. It tells of the Watchers as beings assigned to observe humanity from above, guardians at the edge of the visible sky, patient, disciplined, and meant to remain untouched by human life. At first, the role sounds almost tidy. Watch. Record. Do not interfere. It is the kind of instruction that works beautifully until someone involved has curiosity, loneliness, pride, or all three at once. Then the old text turns. The Watchers look down. They see human women. Desire enters the story like a crack in a stone wall. Slowly at first, then all at once. Their leader, Samyaza, binds the others into a common decision. Because even celestial rebellion apparently likes paperwork of a sort. No one wants to fall alone, so they descend together, 200 of them, according to the old account, leaving the high places where they were meant to remain. Honestly, I have always found that part stranger than the giants. It is not simply that they fall. It is that they choose to become entangled. They take wives. They teach. They settle into the human world with a dangerous kind of generosity. The text says they reveal forbidden knowledge, which is one of those phrases people say quickly and then walk away from as if it explains itself. But when you slow down, the list becomes unsettling. Metalwork, weapons, the courses of stars, charms, cutting roots, the handling of the hidden forces of nature. In one tradition, a Watcher teaches war. In another one teaches signs in the heavens. In another one teaches how to read the sky so precisely that the future begins to look less like mystery and more like scheduling. It is a very old fear. Not merely that knowledge exists, but that it arrives before human beings are gentle enough to hold it. And then come the children. The Nephilim enter the story like a shadow widening over a field. Later readers imagine them in many forms, but the mood in the text is less colorful than heavy. They are excess. They are appetite. They are the consequence of a boundary being crossed and then crossed again. They consume too much. They disturb the order of things. The earth grows burdened. What should have remained in balance begins to tilt. Now, if the story ended there, you could tuck it neatly into the shelf marked Wild Old Myth and go to sleep feeling pleased with your filing system. But the trouble is that the same pattern begins to whisper from other places. Travel east with me, softly now, from the museum hush to the damp breath of the old Mesopotamian world. Imagine river air before dawn. Smooth under sandals. Reeds moving in a low breeze. A city not built all at once, but lifted patiently from the plain by labor, memory, and fear of floodwater. In Sumerian tradition, another group of divine or semi-divine figures appears, the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth. At least in the usual translation, they do not match the Watchers in every detail, and we should be careful there. Some scholars argue these parallels are too loose. Some think later readers love connecting things that were never meant to fit. Fair enough. Still, the resemblance is difficult to ignore once you have noticed it. Before the flood, says the Sumerian king list, kingship descends from heaven, not grows, not evolves, not emerges slowly from village habit and argument around cooking fires. It descends. That one detail lands with peculiar force. Power is not invented. It is delivered. Cities do not merely organize themselves. They receive order from above, or so the text remembers it. Then come those impossible reign lengths, long stretches of rule so absurd by ordinary standards that modern readers either laugh, dismiss, or begin leaning forward despite themselves. Thousands of years, tens of thousands, numbers so large they stop behaving like ordinary time and start sounding like the remains of some older scale of measurement. You can see why the old scribes make modern people nervous. The list continues with calm confidence, naming cities, rulers, years, transfer of kingship, as if nothing here requires apology. The tone is administrative, which almost makes it worse. If a poet wrote it, you could call it ornament. But a list written like a ledger has its own peculiar chill. It feels as though someone expected to be believed. And around these pre-flood worlds move the civilizing figures, the sages, the Apkallu in later Mesopotamian tradition, strange, wise beings associated with foundational knowledge. They are remembered as bringers of arts, measurements, building practices, and ordered life. Here again, the mood shifts in a familiar direction. Civilization does not seem to crawl up painfully from ignorance. It is helped, guided, instructed by beings who possess more than ordinary human skill. That is the quiet repeating note in all this. Humanity does not appear alone. Somewhere between the rivers, under a sky full of stars bright enough to make you feel very small, the first cities are imagined not merely as human achievements, but as collaborations with something older, taller, stranger, or perhaps simply more advanced than the people receiving the gift. Irrigation channels open the land, Temple platforms rise. Astronomical knowledge appears with unnerving confidence. Numbers settle into patterns. Stone and mud begin behaving like memory. A person who wanted to stay skeptical, and there is usually a lot to admire in such a person, could say that this is simply what cultures do. They project perfection backward. They imagine teachers before themselves, because the leap from small settlement to ordered city feels too dramatic to explain without divine help. That may be true. It is debated. We cannot be sure. But then Egypt clears its throat. And when Egypt clears its throat, the room usually listens. Drift with me now to an earlier Nile evening. The river exhales cool air. Mud banks darken. Insects sing where the reeds thicken. Above them, the first stars arrive in strict old positions. And somewhere in that ancient dark, another record begins with divine rule before human rule. The Turin King list. Damaged, fragmentary, and maddening as all precious things like to be, preserves a memory that Egypt too once imagined, a time before ordinary kings. The Netjeru, divine beings. The followers of Horus, rulers before dynastic men. Again, the sequence is familiar. First, the gods. Then, the intermediaries. Then us. The Egyptian version is less interested in lust and corruption than the Enochic version. Its mood is different, more stately, more cosmic, a little less scandalized, and a little more ceremonial. But the pattern remains. There was a time when non-human intelligence, call it divine if you like, stood much nearer to earthly rule. Knowledge of the stars, of order, of sacred construction, of measured alignment, all seems to arrive as inheritance from an earlier and higher age. If you were standing beside one of those old temple sites in the last amber light of day, you might notice how deeply the sky enters the architecture. Egypt was never casual about the heavens. Certain stars mattered with unnerving precision. Sirius, Orion, circumpolar stars that never seemed to die. The Netjeru are tied not only to power, but to celestial order, as if ruling the land and reading the sky were versions of the same act. And perhaps that is the most haunting possibility in this whole opening movement. That these traditions are not merely saying that the gods came down once and did something theatrical. They are saying that civilization itself may have been structured from the beginning by contact with minds that understood geometry, season, death, and time on a scale larger than ordinary human life. Even if you reject the strongest claim, even if you keep your feet planted firmly on the sensible ground of myth, symbolism, and political storytelling, the emotional shape remains the same. Humanity remembers an earlier age in which knowledge stood closer to the heavens, and the line between divine and human had not yet hardened. Then that line did harden, and stories about the beings who crossed it became darker. Before we leave this first chamber of the story, let us widen the circle just a little more. Not too far, only enough to feel the echo. In Hindu tradition, there are divine beings with advanced powers and flying vehicles. In Greek memory, there are elder powers before the Olympians. In Celtic tradition, there are luminous arrivals who bring skill, art, and warcraft, then retreat into the hidden places beneath the hills. None of these stories are identical. They should not be flattened into each other just because modern minds enjoy one grand answer. But when many lamps burn in different rooms, and all of them throw the same kind of shadow, you begin to suspect the house is built around something central. So now the question changes. Not, did one culture imagine heavenly teachers? But why did so many remember them? Why do so many early traditions preserve a scene in which civilization begins under supervision, under interruption, under instruction, under the gaze or hand of non-human powers that know too much and remain too near? The old texts do not answer politely. They only keep opening doors. And the next door is water. Because if these beings once ruled, watched, descended, taught, and changed the shape of the human world, then something happened that ended the first arrangement. Something vast enough to divide the age before from the age after. Something cold, heavy, and ruinous enough to survive in memory under many names. Already, if you listen closely, you can hear it gathering far away, like weather over a river plain at night. The flood does not begin with water, not in stories that last. It begins with a change in the air, with a feeling that the world has become too heavy for its own frame. In the old accounts, whether you listen in Sumer, in Hebrew tradition, in India, or in later retellings that drift like leaves from older trees, the catastrophe gathers first as warning. Noise rises. Corruption thickens. The order of things sags under strain. The beings who once instructed humanity divide among themselves. Some want destruction. Some want preservation. Some seem almost tired, which may be the most human detail of all. Come with me now to the edge of that older world. The river is restless. Reeds bend one way, then another. Mud clings to the ankles of men carrying timber, pitch, baskets, rope. Animals smell what human beings are always so proud of missing. Birds circle low, then vanish inland. Far off, clouds begin arranging themselves into shapes that seem too deliberate to be ordinary weather. Someone has already been warned. That part repeats everywhere. Atrahasis is warned. Noah is warned. Manu is warned. A faithful survivor receives instructions, and the instructions are oddly practical, which is one reason these stories linger like splinters in the mind. Measurements, materials, compartments, what to take, how to seal, how long to endure. If this were only poetry, it is an unusually architectural kind of poetry. In the Mesopotamian flood tradition, the gods are not even perfectly united. That matters more than people often notice. Enlil, in one version, is associated with the decision to wipe humanity back, to reduce the noise, to break the swelling disorder of the earth. Enki, clever, watery, and impossible to keep fully inside the rules, slips warning through the cracks. He does not always speak directly. Sometimes he speaks to a wall, sometimes to a reed screen. Honestly, that feels exactly like the kind of loophole a cosmic intelligence would adore. He preserves obedience by technically violating it in style. And so the vessel is built. I want you to see it slowly. Planks dark with pitch. Wet rope pulled hard through tired hands. the sour smell of animal breath in close quarters, grain sacks stacked where they will not shift, clay jars sealed and checked again, the sky bruising overhead, not yet fully broken, but nearly. People saying less than they want to say because language always becomes clumsy just before disaster. Somewhere close by, a child asks a question no one answers well. Then the weather stops pretending. Rain begins, but not like a familiar rain. Not the kind that moves across the fields and leaves the air cool and kind. This is heavier, stranger, almost vertical in its determination. The old stories say 7 days and 7 nights in some versions, though other details shift from culture to culture. The point is not a tidy meteorological report. The point is duration under assault. Water above, water below, water where pathways used to be, water where memory used to stand. In the epic of Atrahasis, the flood is not merely a storm. It is a correction. In the biblical account, it becomes judgment and reset. In the Indian memory of Manu, the world dissolves under a cosmic deluge, and sacred knowledge itself must be preserved through the passage. That detail is easy to miss if you move too quickly. Not only bodies survive, knowledge survives. Seeds survive. Texts survive. Skills survive. The old world is not simply drowned, it is sorted. And sorting is always more frightening than chaos. There is a moment in these flood traditions that I have always found deeply eerie. It is not the first thunder, not the rising waters. It is the image of the divine beings themselves becoming afraid. In some ancient Near Eastern versions, the gods cower or grieve as the flood rages too fully, as if what they unleashed exceeded even their own appetite for ruin. That image changes everything. The destroyers are not serene. They are overwhelmed by the scale of their own correction. Outside the vessel, civilization loosens. Walls go first in the imagination, then roofs, then roads disappear. Then boundaries between field and river and town and graveyard are swallowed so completely that no one can remember where one ended and the next began. Water has a cruel genius for making categories seem foolish. You can feel why cultures remembered this for millennia, not because every detail remained sharp, but because the emotional shape was unforgettable. The world they relied upon turned liquid and refused to hold them. Now, let us leave the ark for a moment and look at the earth from far above, as modern researchers do when they try to decide whether such stories preserve memory of something real. Around 10800 BC, the Younger Dryas boundary appears in geological discussion like a dark line under a sentence. Sudden cooling, strange particles in sediments, fire, abrupt environmental shift. Debate continues. It is debated fiercely. Some scholars reject catastrophic readings. Others argue that the evidence points to a profound rupture in climate and human life. We cannot be sure of every mechanism. But what matters for this story is not that a modern theory proves an old myth. It is that old myths across distant cultures keep circling the same shape. A previous world. A vast deluge. Survival through selection. Civilization beginning again. But poorer. Poorer. smaller, less complete. That is the part many retellings rush past, and they should not. Post-flood humanity is not presented as triumphant. It survives, yes, but survival is not victory in these ancient memories. Something has been lost. The world after the waters is recognizably the same world, but tightened, dimmed, reduced in scale. The Sumerian king list is perhaps the strangest witness to this. Before the flood, the reigns are impossibly long. After the flood, kingship descends again, but the numbers begin to shrink. Shrinking numbers, that is one of the recurring chills in this material. Lifespans, reigns, ranges of power, all contracting as if the system itself has been adjusted downward. You step out after such a flood, in imagination now, and the first thing you would notice is not hope. It would be silence. Not complete silence. Never that. Water still drips from wood. Mud sucks softly underfoot. A frightened animal pulls against its tether. Someone coughs. But the larger sound, the civic sound, the sound of a world in full use, is gone. No market call. No workshop striking metal. No easy human rhythm. Only aftermath. The earth smells different after drowning. Less like soil than like open depth. Cold clay. Broken roots. Rot just beginning. And over it all, the long, stunned quiet of survivors trying to decide what still exists. In the Enochic material, the flood does not merely punish humanity. It also interrupts the age of the Watchers. Their offspring are to be destroyed. Their corruption answered. Their rule broken. Yet the most unsettling detail is that the Watchers themselves are not simply erased. They are bound, imprisoned, confined. That is a different kind of ending. Azazel, in one strand of the tradition, is cast into darkness, into a pit, into a place of rough stones and burning desolation. Others are buried beneath the earth until an appointed time. The language is vivid, but also strangely physical. Chains is stones, pits, burning places, bound hand and foot. Later readers spiritualize all this, and perhaps they should. But the original mood has an almost geological heaviness to it. This is not eerie exile. It is containment. Imagine that for a moment. Not death, not disappearance. Containment, beneath stone, beneath ground, beneath history, and above them, the world starts over. If you were standing in that restarting world, you would feel immediately that some knowledge survived and some did not. Agriculture returns. Building returns. Ritual returns. Astronomy returns with unnerving speed in certain places. Yet something richer, stranger, more direct is gone. It is as if the great flame has been covered, but embers remain under ash. This is where the old stories become less like clean myths and more like lingering trauma. Humanity remembers being taught too much, losing almost everything, and then rebuilding with fragments. Fragments can be very powerful. They can also be very dangerous. In the Indian flood memory, sacred wisdom is carried through catastrophe. In Mesopotamia, sages and civilizing knowledge reappear after the waters. In later traditions, teachers rise again from hidden places, or certain lineages preserve what the wider world has forgotten. The pattern is too consistent to ignore, even if we remain cautious about the conclusions. Catastrophe does not eliminate knowledge. It buries it unevenly. That uneven burial may be the true source of the ancient world's haunted feeling. Some communities remember a little more. Some remember only symbols. Some keep rituals whose original purpose has grown dim. Some inherit stories that sound impossible because the world that made them possible is gone. A temple stands where a machine once stood in memory. A rite survives where a science once lived. A prayer keeps the rhythm of an instruction no one fully understands anymore. That is how deep time often looks from the human side. I think that is why the flood in these traditions is so much more than weather. It explains not only ruin, but partial ignorance. Why civilizations seem to wake already, holding advanced ideas whose origin feels older than their own official beginnings. Why sacred sites appear where full explanation is missing. Why old texts speak with such calm confidence about worlds more ordered and more terrible than the one that remains. Now we must come back to the bound ones. Because the flood breaks their open rule, but it does not close the case. The old account says they witnessed the destruction of what they made. They endure confinement. Their knowledge becomes forbidden, hidden, dispersed among humans who retain portions of it. This is the crucial pivot in the story. Before the flood, divine interference is direct. After the flood, it becomes indirect. The stage is no longer ruled openly by the instructors. Instead, their legacy moves under the surface, into buried places, hidden schools, inherited fragments, private rites, secret lineages. The world becomes quieter, yes, but also more mysterious. You can feel the mood change right there, like a room dimming. Before, the gods are outside, in the open. After, they are under the ground, behind the veil, inside old stone, inside blood, inside memory. That is why the flood matters so much in this narrative. It is not only the end of a corrupt age, it is the beginning of concealment. And concealment has its own atmosphere. Think of hidden chambers beneath a temple. Think of old instructions recited without full understanding. Think of a people rebuilding on top of drowned foundations, sensing that they have inherited a map but lost the legend. Think of stories about ancient rulers that sound too large for comfort. Think of children asking who taught the first teachers, and adults growing quiet because the old answer is no longer safe. By now, the room around us has grown darker. The candle has shortened a little. The museum hush has followed us even here, into flood mud and ruined plains. Dust has become clay. Clay has become memory. Memory has become a question. What exactly survived? Not simply who, not simply what artifact, but what pattern? Because the old world does not seem to vanish completely. It withdraws. It breaks apart. It goes below. And once an idea goes below rather than dying, it can return in strange forms, A legend here, a ritual there, a hidden chamber, a bloodline claim, a geometry no one can quite explain. The flood closes one chapter with water and opens the next in stone, darkness and secrecy. So let the water recede now. Let the mud cool. Let the survivors begin their small, patient rebuilding. Let the visible age of the Watchers sink beneath the horizon of ordinary history. And let us follow the next whisper. Because after the flood, the question is no longer whether the old powers existed. The question is where they went, and how far under the earth, under the mountains, under the temples, under the memory of civilization, they chose to wait. When the waters pull back in old stories, they do not leave behind a clean world. They leave behind a silence that feels occupied. That is where we begin tonight. Not with a trumpet of renewal. Not with bright survivors planting cheerful gardens under a washed sky. We begin with whetstone, with river breath moving through broken reeds, with mud drying on the lower walls of places that used to be homes, and with a feeling that something powerful has not departed at all. It has only gone lower. If you were standing there with me, your sandals would sink a little. The earth after catastrophe is strangely tender. It gives underfoot. It keeps the memory of water longer than the eye expects. Pools remain in places where streets once held dust. Insects skim over their surfaces. A bit of roof beam, dark and swollen, lies caught against a stand of reeds. Somewhere close by, a clay vessel has rolled onto its side and settled there, half filled with silt, as if the river had reached into the house, chosen a single object, and carried it away like a souvenir. This is the first feeling of the post-flood age. Not triumph, not even relief. It is caution. People emerge into that caution with slow movements. They test the ground. They look toward the horizon as if water might change its mind and return. They inventory what remains. Rope, grain, seed, fire, animal breath, children's hands, memory, always memory. That is the most fragile cargo of all, because it lives nowhere secure. It sits inside tired bodies, inside frightened speech, inside the old songs spoken correctly or incorrectly by those who still remember how they begin. And in so many traditions, one thought begins settling into this damaged world almost immediately. The old powers are not gone. They are beneath. That idea appears in different robes. In some places it is the prison of the Watchers. In others it is the netherworld, the hidden mountain, the sealed chamber, the deep place behind the roots of the earth. Names differ. The feeling does not. Something once ruled in the open. Then the flood came. Then that rule passed below the visible world, where it remained dangerous, precisely because it remained unfinished. I have always found that more unsettling than open judgment ends a chapter. Burial preserves it. The Enochic tradition gives us one of the clearest versions. The rebellious Watchers are bound in valleys of the earth, beneath rough stones, beneath darkness, until a later reckoning. Notice the texture of that punishment. It is geological, not airy. not abstract. These are beings pressed into the architecture of the planet itself, as if stone has become lock and sentence at the same time. Their children perish in the flood narrative, but their teachers remain in confinement. Knowledge, then, is not erased. It is trapped with its keepers. That is a very different image from simple annihilation. Now drift with me toward Mesopotamia again, where the land itself teaches this lesson every season. Between the rivers, the ground remembers layers. Cities are built, broken, buried, built again. A mound is never merely a hill. It is a stack of former lives compressed into earth. Walk upon one, and you are already walking over houses, shrines, courtyards, kitchen fires, bones, tablets, and forgotten names. The people who lived there knew this. They dug foundations and found older walls. They cut into ground and struck older brick. The earth was not empty beneath them. It was crowded with previous attempts. So when Sumerian and Akkadian texts speak of the underworld, of Kur, of the deep place, of descent through gates, they do so in a landscape where beneath is not an idea, but a daily fact. Beneath means older. Beneath means hidden. Beneath means what still supports your life, while refusing to show its full face. Some scholars argue that later readers go too far when they imagine secret underground civilizations or literal imprisoned sky beings beneath temples and mounds. Fair enough. We should be careful. Yet it remains true that the symbolic geography is unusually consistent. Divine or semi-divine powers recede from open rule into enclosed spaces. The dead go down. Sacred knowledge is stored below. Important texts are buried in foundation deposits. Priests descend into inner chambers. The holy and the hidden become intimate companions. If you stand in the shade of a Mesopotamian temple platform at dusk, when the heat is finally loosening and the bricks exhale the day back into the air, you can almost feel why. A ziggurat is not only a way up, it implies a way down. Every raised sacred mountain is also built over a store of darkness. Every ascent depends on something buried. The temple points to the heavens, yes, but it also anchors itself in old mud, old offerings, old chambers, old dead kings, old tablets wrapped in clay and sealed away. Civilization looks upward with its rituals and downward with its memory. Egypt shares the same haunted architecture, only with more stone and more composure. Move with me into the cool interior of an old temple. Your footsteps change there. Outside, sand mutters. Inside, stone listens. The air is still. The corridor narrows. Lamps once burned here with a smell of oil and soot. Priests passed through chambers where sunlight failed, and walls carried images of the gods, as if they lived just on the other side of the carved surface. Below some structures were crypts, sealed rooms, storerooms of ritual objects, spaces where sacred things rested away from ordinary sight. Above ground, ceremony. Below ground, containment. And Egypt too remembered an earlier age when divine beings ruled more openly. After that age, kings inherit forms, titles, and regalia that feel older than any single dynasty. The first rulers in memory are always closer to the divine than the ones who follow. Then comes distance. Then ritual becomes substitute for presence. That may be one of the quietest tragedies in ancient religion. Ritual is what remains when direct contact has ended. A priest recites because a god no longer speaks plainly. A king imitates because the first rulers are gone. A temple aligns with stars because the teachers who once read the sky directly have withdrawn. A hidden chamber guards sacred objects because those objects have become the nearest surviving pieces of a vanished conversation. Honestly, when you lay the old traditions side by side, that is the mood that keeps returning. Humanity is living on inheritance, not origin. And inheritance can be a burden. Think of the survivors after the flood, trying to rebuild a world with fragments of celestial instruction still embedded in language. Stonework, seasonal rites, number systems, astronomy, burial customs, and kingship myths. They know enough to repeat. They do not know enough to fully understand. That is how a civilization begins sounding older than it is. It speaks with a borrowed gravity. It handles tools whose deepest meanings have already slipped backward into sacred story. This is where the under-earth motif grows so strong. It becomes the natural location of whatever has been lost but not destroyed. Hidden books go under stone. Bound angels go under mountains. Treasures go under temples. Initiation takes place below ground. The dead carry memory downward. Oracles rise from cracks. Serpents guard thresholds. Wise kings descend for knowledge. Heroes enter caves to speak with shades. The old world, after the flood, is no longer above us in the sky. It is below us in the earth. Pause there for a moment. It changes the whole emotional weather of human life. Before the catastrophe, dangerous knowledge descends. After the catastrophe, dangerous knowledge must be excavated. One movement falls from above. The next rises from below. That pattern appears again and again, and it is one reason mountains, tombs, caves, wells, crypts, and foundation pits feel so charged in ancient storytelling. They are not empty holes. They are seams, places where worlds touch. Places where buried time can breathe upward for a moment if approached with the right ritual, the right courage, or the wrong kind of curiosity. You know that feeling when you walk into an old cellar and the air changes immediately. Kula, Dampa, more serious. Your voice sounds different there. Ancient people built entire cosmologies out of that sensation. The lower world is not only where things are stored. It is where rules change. That is why the post-flood age becomes an age of mediation. Priests stand between people and what is hidden. Kings stand between cities and the old descending authority. Scribes stand between memory and oblivion. Ritual stands between ordinary life and the dangerous remains of the first world. Everyone is translating. A later person might call this religion. A tired person might call it administration. The old world probably called it survival. Some of the most curious traditions preserve the idea that sacred beings were not destroyed in the flood, but divided. Some imprisoned, some sleeping, some wandering. some reduced to spirits. In one line of thought, the bodies of the giant offspring perish, but their disembodied spirits remain active, restless, troublesome, moving close to the human world. Whether you take that literally or symbolically, the effect is the same. Catastrophe does not clean the field. It leaves residue, and residue is where fear likes to live. Imagine rebuilding a town while telling your children that the old corrupt teachers are beneath the hills and their offspring move unseen through the air. Imagine harvesting grain while your priest reminds you that sacred order must be maintained, or the deep places may open again. Imagine founding a kingdom while your royal titles still insist that kingship descends from heaven, even though the heavens have gone quiet and the old instructors now lie bound below stone. That is not a simple beginning. It is a haunted continuation. If you were there with me at the edge of evening, among the first rebuilt shrines and first post-flood walls, you would notice how careful everything feels. Corners are measured. Offerings are placed. Gates are named. Thresholds matter. Purification matters. Burials matter. The dead must be handled correctly. The holy must be approached correctly. The king must be enthroned correctly. Why? Because when a world feels recently broken, procedure becomes comfort. And procedure, in ancient civilization, so often grows around fear of the hidden. The temple must be fed. The gods must be honored. The dead must remain below. The old powers must stay contained. The inherited knowledge must not be misused again. There is even a quiet humor in it. If you tilt your head slightly, humanity survives an age of divine interference and immediately begins creating very careful rules to manage divine interference. We are a species that turns trauma into liturgy with astonishing speed. Yet beneath the humor there is sadness. The survivors do not seem to believe they are building something wholly new. They seem to believe they are preserving a reduced pattern of something older and greater. That is why their myths look backward so often. Golden Age, first kings, first teachers, before the flood, before the walls broke, before the long silence from the sky, before the buried age. And once that backward gaze begins, it never quite stops. The next step in the story is almost inevitable. If the old powers are beneath, if their knowledge is buried, if kingship survives only as diminished inheritance, then some people will begin searching. Quietly, ritually, politically, desperately, they will dig into mounds, open old chambers, found priesthoods, guard genealogies, claim descent, claim authorization, claim that they alone remember how the First Order worked. That search leads us into the age of sacred kings, hidden wisdom, and rulers who do not merely govern people, but attempt to stand in for the vanished powers that once stood openly among them. And that is where the darkness thickens again. By the time the post-flood world has dried enough for roads to hold a footprint, a new kind of ambition has begun to rise from the mud. It is not enough now to survive. Someone must rule. Someone must interpret the sky. Someone must stand between ordinary people and the buried memory of the First Age. This is where kings become more than strong men with armed followers. They become substitutes for absence. Come with me into one of those early cities at dawn. The river is still half asleep. Smoke lifts from hearths in thin, pale lines. A gate opens with the long, tired groan of heavy wood. Beyond it, houses of mud brick sit close enough to share warmth and gossip. Above them all, the temple platform rises in stages, catching the first light before anything else. You can feel the meaning without hearing it explained. The temple sees first. The ruler, if he is wise, places himself near that height. That is one of the oldest political dreams. If the gods no longer walk openly, then perhaps a king can be dressed to resemble the memory of when they did. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible pre-flood rulers and shrinking post-flood numbers, gives us the emotional blueprint. Authority once came from above. After catastrophe, it comes again, but dimmer, shorter, more fragile. The post-flood king inherits not only a throne, but a wound. He must rule a world that remembers divine order while lacking direct access to it. So what does he do? He builds. He performs. He legitimizes. He turns memory into institution. If you were standing beside a new ruler in that world, you would not merely see a politician. You would see regalia heavy with old meaning. Crown, staff, robe, measured space, elevated seat, ritual meal, procession, gate, offering. These are not decorations. They are arguments. Each object says the same thing in a different accent. Order has not died. It has only changed hands. And yet everyone knows the hand is now human. That tension lives everywhere in the old world. Kings are exalted, but not quite divine in the old direct way. Priests preserve sacred knowledge, but they are interpreters, not original teachers. Temples align with celestial patterns, but the sky no longer gives easy answers. Rule becomes theater in the most serious sense. Performance keeps panic away. If the forms remain intact, perhaps the world will too. Egypt perfects this into stone. Mesopotamia works it in brick and law. Later cultures inherit versions of it like family silver that no one entirely trusts, but no one dares to melt down. Let us drift to Egypt for a while, because if any civilization understood how to make political order feel ancient on purpose, it was Egypt. Stand at the edge of a temple court in the first light. Columns hold painted ceilings overhead. The stone is cool against the morning air. Priests move with shaved heads and practiced hands. Incense rises. Somewhere within the inner rooms, an image of the god waits in darkness until ritual wakes it. Outside, the pharaoh is called son of a god, image of a god, keeper of Ma at the balance that holds world against chaos. Notice how careful that arrangement is. The king is not merely a leader. He is a bridge. The older divine age cannot return openly, so a human body becomes its instrument. This is brilliant, elegant, and just a little tragic. Everyone acts out nearness to the gods because distance has already begun. Some scholars argue that this is just the normal evolution of sacred kingship. No imprisoned beings required. No buried teachers. no secret catastrophe older than the texts. That is a fair reading. Still, the emotional pattern remains hauntingly familiar. The ruler embodies what the world fears losing: stability, celestial legitimacy, measured order, continuity with a higher source. If the source were still obvious, the embodiment would be less necessary. In Mesopotamia, the same tension takes a more anxious form. Kings boast of temple restoration, of restoring ancient rites, of returning forgotten cults to proper use, of rebuilding what the flood, or time, or enemy hands had broken. That language matters. Restoration is the political verb of a civilization that believes the best order belongs to the past. A king does not merely create. He recovers. He repairs. He realigns the damaged world with a pattern older than himself. That is why old inscriptions are so full of buried foundations and rediscovered deposits. A ruler opens the earth and finds an older king had built here first. He reads the old name. He places his own work beside it. He does not want to stand alone. He wants to be continuous with the chain. One more link in a line that reaches backward toward the first descent of kingship from heaven. Continuity is a kind of protection. Honestly, it is also a kind of nervousness. Only anxious civilizations insist so often that they are restoring the ancient correct order. Imagine the sensory life of such a kingship. The smell of cedar brought from far away. Bitumen warming in sun on a building site. Wet clay tablets laid out to dry. Bronze tools ringing against stone. Scribes murmuring line after line while copying old names no one living has met. Courtiers adjusting robes. Priests timing rituals to lunar stations and heliacal risings. Behind it all, the great low certainty that if the forms are neglected, disorder may rise from below again. Because the buried age is never fully gone. It sits under every temple and every throne like pressure under the earth. This is where myths of hidden wisdom grow almost naturally. If the first teachers are absent, then wisdom must be preserved in secret. Not because secrecy is fashionable, but because the knowledge is dangerous, fragmentary, or too old for ordinary handling. So we begin to see guarded priesthoods, initiation rites, restricted texts, sacred measurements passed from elder to novice with careful ceremony. Temples become archives as much as shrines. Palaces become memory machines. The city itself becomes a device for holding inherited fragments without letting them spill everywhere at once. And in that atmosphere, certain rulers begin to seem more than political. They become mediators of the forgotten. Think of Gilgamesh. The historical king, if we can still glimpse him through the myth, becomes in later memory not only a ruler, but a seeker into the old, deep structure of the world. He confronts wildness. He meets beings older than cities. He travels toward the flood survivor. He seeks what human kings are not supposed to reach. Immortality, the first knowledge, the answer that would close the wound between divine age and human age. He fails, of course, because this kind of story is cruel in a very ancient way. The king can approach the secret. He cannot own it. He returns with walls, with story, with a lesser victory. Civilization again settles for preservation when transcendence does not come. That is another recurring sorrow in this material. Human kings keep reaching toward the old order and returning with architecture. Useful, beautiful, meaningful architecture, yes, but still. Walls are what you build when the sky remains silent. There is also the priestly side of this world, and I do not want to hurry past it. Priests in the ancient sense are often made to sound dull by modern retellings. They were many things, and dull was not always one of them. They measured stars, interpreted comens, handled statues that stood in for absent presence, opened and closed access to the inner rooms, memorized hymns so old that by the time they were recited, the original language could already feel ancient. A priest moved through time differently from an ordinary farmer or laborer. He lived among repetitions designed to keep memory alive. And memory, in a post-flood civilization, is the most sacred substance after water. Step with me into a hidden chamber for a moment. The air is close and still. Outside, the city mutters with trade, argument, carts, children, animals. In here, none of that enters cleanly. The walls hold coolness. A lamp burns. A ritual object lies wrapped in cloth. A tablet rests sealed in clay. On the wall, a god looks out in profile with old, patient eyes. The priest unfolds the cloth. He does not merely handle an object. He handles continuity. He keeps the surviving pattern from being lost entirely to ordinary time. That is the noblest version of priesthood. There is another version too, naturally. The one where hidden knowledge becomes hidden power, where gatekeeping hardens into control, where being near the sacred lets a person command others by claiming privileged access to what lies below or above. Ancient religion, like modern institutions, is not improved simply by incense. Yet even the darker version confirms the same point. The buried age remains politically useful precisely because it still feels real. A ruler can say, "I restore the first order." A priest can say, "I preserve the old wisdom." A dynasty can say, "Our blood descends from the first kings." A temple can say, "The God still dwells here." And people, tired by flood, famine, war, and the simple daily work of staying alive, may very reasonably want to believe them, because belief is steadier than chaos. This also explains the rise of sacred mountains and holy centers. The world after catastrophe longs for stable nodes, places where heaven and earth still seem to touch. Mountain tops, temple mounds, primal hills, axis points. In many traditions, the first land to emerge after flood is elevated. High place survives. High place receives. High place becomes holy. That pattern travels astonishingly far across cultures. Again, we should be careful about making everything the same story. But it is hard not to feel the family resemblance. Water wipes flat. Height returns form. And whoever controls the high place controls the story of renewal. That is why kings and priesthoods cluster there, not only for defense or spectacle, though both help. They gather there because altitude itself feels like argument. The temple stands above flood memory. The palace stands near the temple. The ruler stands where people can look up. It is all very literal and therefore very effective. A city needs orientation after catastrophe. The sacred center gives it. Still, beneath the center lies the other truth. The old world is buried, not healed. Ruins remain under the floor. The first teachers remain absent. The chains remain in the deep places. The giant age is over, but its memory stains everything that follows. So the rebuilt civilization becomes layered with longing. It performs order while suspecting that order used to come more easily. It preserves texts while knowing some original knowledge is gone. It crowns kings while remembering reigns that lasted impossibly longer. It watches the heavens while inheriting star lore older than its own institutions. It buries its dead correctly and hopes the lower realms remain sealed and managed. A little humor enters here too, quietly. Humanity spends centuries building elaborate systems so that no one has to admit how uncertain everyone feels. If that is not ancient, noble, and slightly ridiculous, I do not know what is. Yet there is tenderness in it as well. People copied tablets because they feared forgetting. People restored temples because they feared misalignment. People recorded king lists because they feared rupture. People wrapped sacred objects and placed them in dark chambers because they feared the day would come when open memory failed. And open memory always does fail. Eventually. That is why the next chapter of our story grows even more hushed. Once kingship and priesthood have done their best to hold the old pattern together, a new question emerges in the shadows. If the first order is gone from sight, and the human world survives only through fragments, then where exactly did the surviving knowledge settle? In stone, in bloodlines, in rituals, in forbidden books, in hidden chambers, in dreams, in desert monasteries, in mountain libraries, in lineages who claim they still remember the names that ordinary people have forgotten. The search becomes narrower now, quieter, no longer for open rule by the old powers, but for traces. And traces are enough to change the whole shape of history. The search for traces begins quietly. It almost always does. No empire announces that it has lost the center and is now hunting the crumbs. It speaks instead of restoration, wisdom, legitimacy, purification, renewal. But under those polished words lies a simpler movement. People start looking for what slipped away. So let us walk more softly now. The great temple courts remain behind us. The public rituals still glow at the edge of vision. Yet, the path narrows. It leads through lesser doors, through archive rooms, through desert storehouses, through mountain shrines where wind drags dust over old thresholds, and where the silence feels less empty than watchful. If you were with me there, the first thing you might notice would be smell. Dry reed baskets, a little lamp oil, clay warmed by the day and cooling now, old linen, cedar splinters, bitumen, the air of preservation. That is a particular atmosphere, and ancient people knew it well. There is a difference between a room that is lived in and a room that is guarding something. In the old world after catastrophe, guarded rooms multiply. texts are copied and hidden. Ritual formulas are memorized by a narrowing circle. Foundation deposits are placed beneath fresh walls. Amulets are sealed into stone cavities. An old king leaves a record for a future king who may never know his face, but who might one day open the earth and find his name waiting like a hand reaching upward through centuries. This is one of the gentlest and saddest forms of hope. Not that the truth will remain obvious, but that it might remain buried well enough to survive. The Near Eastern world gave this hope physical form again and again. Tablets in boxes, inscriptions under thresholds, sealed chambers in temples, buried figurines placed at corners to protect foundations, lists of offerings, lists of stars, lists of kings, lists of the dead, lists of rites to be done if plague comes, if the river fails, if an eclipse darkens the afternoon, if the gods fall silent for too long. Lists are what frightened civilizations make when they no longer trust memory to carry the whole weight by itself. And memory, by then, had become a strained animal. You can see the strain in the way later texts keep glancing backward. Before the flood, before the old kings died out, before the great wrong turn, before the age of shortened lives, before the watchers were bound, before the giant violence, before the gods withdrew into hidden chambers and holy images and difficult signs. A culture that feels secure in the present does not speak so often of before. That is why secret knowledge begins gathering prestige, not because secrecy is glamorous, but because anything still intact from the first age would almost have to be hidden by now. The open world is too exposed. Armies burn libraries. Rivers change course. Dynasties collapse. Languages shift. Priests die without finishing instruction. Children survive without inheriting everything. Public things are fragile. Hidden things last longer. Some scholars argue that we should resist romanticizing secrecy, and they are right to warn us. Not every hidden chamber contains wisdom. Sometimes it contains accounting. Sometimes a broom. Sometimes a jar with nothing in it but old dust and disappointment. Ancient people were practical. They stored ordinary things too. Still, the symbolic pattern remains. What is most charged tends to move inward and downward, into crypts, into temple libraries, into initiation rites, into whispered names, into the minds of those who are told not to speak too freely. That movement changes the emotional life of religion. The first age, in so many stories, is loud. Angels descend. Great kings rule for impossible spans. Divine judgments arrive in weather. Corruption grows huge enough to stain the whole earth. Giants walk. Watchers teach. Floods answer. Everything is oversized. But the later age, the age most humans actually inhabit, becomes narrow and careful. Now the important thing is remembering the formula correctly. Preserving a line of transmission. Finding the right chamber. Reading the cracked tablet. Interpreting the omen. Dreaming the right dream. Locating the hill beneath which the old foundation still sleeps. The scale shrinks, but the tension grows. Honestly, That is one reason the later age can feel more eerie than the first. Catastrophe is terrible, but it is obvious. Inheritance is quieter. It lets you live normally while suspecting that what matters most has been hidden just out of sight. This is where lineages become so important. Families of priests, schools of scribes, houses of healers, dynasties claiming descent from ancient founders. Their social function is practical. Of course, they preserve skill, but their imaginative function is deeper. They suggest that continuity has not been entirely broken. Somewhere the thread remains uncut. If you are sitting in a late evening schoolroom in an old city, you might hear a master scribe correcting a younger hand on a tablet. Press here, not there. This wedge is wrong. That sign belongs to another age of the language. Copy it exactly. Do not improve it. Do not modernize it. Keep the old shape. There is something almost sacred in that refusal to simplify. Preservation is obedience to what came first. And yet the ironies accumulate. A young student copies a text whose deepest meaning he may not fully grasp. A priest recites a hymn in a language already old. A king funds the restoration of rights that once legitimized kings far greater than himself. A civilization preserves knowledge while no longer standing fully inside the world that produced it. That is what makes archives feel ghostly. They are full of speech that survives its speakers. Move with me now toward Judea, where this same mood takes another form. The memory of fallen beings, corrupted knowledge, flood judgment, and divine withdrawal lingers there too, though in different language. Apocalyptic imagination grows wherever a people feel crushed between inherited revelation and present disorder. Enochic writings are one response. They preserve cosmic memory through visionary tours, heavenly books, lists of angelic names, journeys through chambers of judgment, mountains of punishment, prisons of stars, and tablets of human history already written before events fully unfold. What is that if not an archive projected into the cosmos? A heavenly library is a beautiful answer to earthly forgetting. If earthly books burn, perhaps the true record remains above. If the first wisdom has been corrupted below, perhaps its untouched version remains with God. If the Watchers taught forbidden things on earth, perhaps righteous vision can recover true order from beyond the earth. Yet even there, the pattern is still one of restricted access. Not everyone reads those books. Not everyone receives that tour. Revelation itself becomes selective. Chosen seers, sealed writings, appointed times. The truth exists, but ordinary history is too damaged to hold it in the open for long. I have always found that division more haunting than simple unbelief. It means two people can stand under the same evening sky and inhabit completely different worlds. One sees stars. Another sees records. One sees weather. Another sees signs held back since the first rebellion. That is why caves are everywhere in sacred narrative. Caves are the simplest architecture of hidden truth. They are mouths in the earth. They promise shelter and threat in the same breath. Hermits go there. Prophets hear there. Sibyls mutter there. Dead kings are buried there. Future revelations are sealed there. You enter a cave and the world above keeps going without you for a while. When you come out, even if nothing measurable has changed, the light looks slightly different. The same is true of tombs. In the old world, a tomb is never only a grave. It is a statement about continuity, status, memory, and the hope that something about a person can survive the collapse of the ordinary body. That hope becomes politically explosive when attached to kings. Because if a king can be entombed magnificently, preserved, hidden, remembered, and approached with offerings long after death, then the dead ruler is no longer fully absent. He becomes another kind of buried presence. Egypt is especially eloquent about this. The tomb is house, passage, machine, sealed world, and cosmic diagram all at once. Food is placed. Names are carved. Images are arranged to keep life moving in another register. Burial becomes engineering. And again we encounter the same post-catastrophe instinct. If life above is unstable, build durability below. The pyramids are extreme examples, but the instinct runs far wider. Smaller tombs, hidden chambers, necropolis cut into rock, sealed caches of funerary equipment, protective texts wrapped with bodies, hidden names guarded from decay, all participate in the same gentle defiance. The world may shorten lives. Stone may lengthen memory. Now let us move closer to the edge, where preservation becomes discovery. Because once a culture has buried enough of itself, a later culture will start finding things. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes greedily, sometimes reverently. A farmer cutting a foundation trench strikes old brick. A shepherd shelters in a cave and finds jars. A temple is rebuilt and older stones appear beneath. A grave robber enters for gold and exits with texts. An empire conquers a city and carries off old statues whose meanings travel badly into foreign courts. In that moment, the hidden age returns in fragments. That return is rarely clean. Objects lose context. Texts lose half their lines. New rulers reinterpret old symbols to suit new needs. Yet even broken discovery has power. A single buried inscription can reshape a dynasty. A rediscovered ritual can legitimize a temple reform. A half-understood oracle can launch a movement. Hidden things do not need to be whole to be dangerous. This is why so many later rulers present themselves as finders as much as builders. I found the ancient foundation. I recovered the original rite. I restored the forgotten image. I reopened the sealed sanctuary. The claim is political gold. It says I am not improvising. I am returning us to source. Whether that source is ever fully known is another matter. Some of the most moving scenes in ancient memory are those where a later person encounters an older text and realizes that the dead are still speaking. The tablet is cracked. The script is old. The room smells of dust and enclosed air. A lamp is brought nearer. The signs begin to yield, and across centuries, someone who expected silence receives instructions, warnings, genealogies, liturgies, prophecies, laws, names. It is hard not to feel a shiver there. Not because magic has occurred, but because writing itself is a mild and lawful form of haunting. The hidden age had not vanished. It had waited. And once you accept that, the world begins feeling deeper in every direction. A mound might be a library. A tomb might be a map. A ruined temple might still contain a correct measurement that a living builder has forgotten. A forbidden book might preserve the names of bound beings. A lineage mocked as old-fashioned might be carrying the only surviving memory of a foundational rite. Everything ordinary develops a basement. This, I think, is where our story turns toward the modern unease that still clings to museums, excavations, and climate-controlled archives. Because the search for traces never ended, it only changed costume. Priest becomes archaeologist. Temple library becomes museum storage. Scribe becomes curator. Buried foundation deposit becomes cataloged object under glass. Pilgrimage becomes research visit. The human feeling remains eerily similar. We still descend into storage rooms, hunting continuity. We still brush dust from old surfaces, hoping the dead left us something intelligible. We still believe, half rationally and half emotionally, that a buried fragment may unlock an old pattern, if only handled with enough care. And in the next part, that buried fragment will begin speaking more clearly. By the time a buried fragment begins speaking clearly, the world around it has usually changed beyond recognition. The hands that shaped it are gone. Their cities are names in catalogs. Their gods survive as debated symbols. Their kings are lines in textbooks, if they are remembered at all. And yet the object remains. A tablet, a seal, a funerary text, a broken inscription, a carved boundary stone, a shard with only half a phrase. The hidden age reaches upward through these things and touches a later mind. That touch is where our story must go now. Come with me into a museum basement, or something like one. The hum of controlled air is low and steady. Light is cooler here than the light of temples and hearths. Metal shelves hold gray boxes. Numbers appear everywhere, neat and patient. The room is clean in the modern sense, but still the old smell finds a way through. Clay has a scent. Old linen has a scent. Stone that has slept in earth for centuries has a scent too. Faint and dry and mineral, like a memory that does not want to become language, but knows it must. If you were standing there with me, gloved hands might pass a tablet onto a padded tray. It would look smaller than the fear it contains. That is often the way. The most unsettling things in human history are regularly pocket-sized. A few lines of script, a sign repeated in a pattern, the measured record of a king who ruled too long, a descent through gates, a prison below mountains, a list of watchers, a flood that reset the count, tiny objects, enormous implications. Modern people like to imagine that discovery feels triumphant. Sometimes it does. More often, it feels intimate and unnerving. You lean closer. A sign resolves. A phrase emerges. Then another. Suddenly, the dead are not dead in the abstract. They are specific. They counted this. They feared this. They buried this deliberately. They wanted someone, maybe not you exactly, but someone later, to know. I have always found that moment both tender and almost unbearably eerie. Not because ancient people become alien, but because they become familiar with unsettling speed. The museum hush matters here. In old sacred spaces, silence was preparation. In modern archives, silence is method. Still, emotionally, they overlap. Both ask the same courtesy. Lower your voice. Something fragile is present. This is where the modern world begins performing its own priesthood, though it would rather not phrase it that way. Specialists learn old languages. They handle restricted objects. They interpret damaged signs. They debate proper context. They preserve, classify, and sometimes guard. A curator can look remarkably like an ancient temple keeper if you squint through enough centuries. The outer language has changed. The inner posture has not. Careful hands, controlled access, reverence mixed with procedure. There is even a little comedy in it. We flatter ourselves that we have escaped the old sacred world, then build climate-controlled vaults for clay tablets and speak in hushed tones around them. Human beings truly cannot help sacralizing what carries deep time. Yet the content of those objects can still cut through our procedures and make the room feel unexpectedly older than modernity. A king list with impossible reigns. A descent text counting stages of stripping. An underworld map that reads like administrative documentation. A funerary formula preserving the dead by name. A flood narrative that does not sound like a metaphor. At least not only a metaphor, but like a civilization, insisting that history itself was broken and resumed. Some scholars argue that our discomfort comes less from the texts themselves than from our own hunger for pattern. We want the old world to be stranger than it was, more esoteric, more prophetic, more aligned with our present anxieties. Again, a fair warning. We should be disciplined. Not every broken tablet is a cosmic confession. Not every myth is a coded manual. But discipline does not remove the force of the best evidence. Sometimes the old texts do read with alarming plainness. This happened. This was counted. This was done. This was buried. This was restored. This was feared. And once read, those statements do not easily return to sleep. Let us think for a while about ruins. Not the romantic version with moonlight and ivy, though that has its place. I mean the actual physical intelligence of ruins. A wall line under soil. A layer of ash. A flood deposit. A rebuilt threshold with older stone reused in the base. Archaeology is the science of interrupted intention. It studies what people tried to make permanent and how time answered them. Every trench through an ancient mound is a vertical history of hope and failure. Walk slowly with me down one of those trench edges at sunrise. The cut reveals bands of earth. Brick, plaster, charcoal, debris. Here, a floor. Below it, another floor. Below that, collapse. Then occupation again. Then abandonment. Then rebuild. The soil itself begins to resemble the mythic pattern. Rise. Apex. Destruction. Burial. Return. Shorter span. Another return. You do not have to impose the cycle. It is staring up from the section wall. This is one reason the old flood and reset narratives keep their emotional grip. Ruined cities really do look like interrupted worlds. A later person standing among them can hardly avoid imagining that some larger hand once swept over and left only fragments for the patient to interpret. And fragments alter the mind. A complete system tells you what it is. A fragment invites you in. It requires reconstruction, comparison, patience, and imagination. That is why buried texts can become so powerful. They do not merely inform, they recruit. They draw later minds into their unfinished work. The moment you try to restore a missing line, place a broken artifact back into a ritual context, or understand why a chamber was sealed, you have already joined the chain of preservation. The dead are no longer only past. They are collaborators. That may be the strangest intimacy of all. Think of the long centuries when ancient scripts lay unread. Tablets survived while languages died. Entire archives rested in the dark beneath collapsed roofs. Then one era after another passed above them, each busy with its own certainties, each largely unaware that buried nearby sat older thoughts, waiting for the right set of eyes. When decipherment finally comes, it can feel less like invention than like reopening a closed gate. A sign matches another sign. A bilingual inscription gives a key. A pattern repeats. A proper name stabilizes. A grammar emerges from what had looked like scratches. And with that, silence ends. Imagine the first scholars who began hearing Mesopotamia speak again through cuneiform. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Kings reappeared. Floods reappeared. Underworlds, rituals, contracts, hymns, omens, star lists, laments. The old world, buried for so long, proved not mute, but delayed. It had simply required its future listeners. If you were there in those first decades of decipherment, I suspect the excitement would have been mixed with disorientation. Whole assumptions about origins would begin shifting. Stories thought unique would acquire older cousins. Biblical landscapes would thicken with deeper histories. Familiar moral narratives would develop older geological layers. The human past would stop looking like a clean corridor and begin resembling a city mound. One civilization stacked over another, all of them leaking into the next. That is where museums become unsettling in a special way. They are not only repositories of objects, they are theaters of delayed recognition. You walk in expecting art or history and discover instead that the foundations of your cultural memory are more crowded than you had been told. A single tablet can lengthen the ancestry of an idea by 1,000 years. A single burial can force a revision of how a people understood death. A single rebuilt temple plan can reveal that continuity survived where historians once assumed rupture. The everyday visitor feels this too, even without technical knowledge. Why does a clay tablet behind glass feel so serious? Why does a small carved stone figure seem to hold more weather than a modern sculpture? Why do old funerary texts make the skin prickle? Because they carry solved fear and unsolved fear together. The ancient makers solved the problem of preservation. We have not solved the problem of what to do with what has been preserved. And much of what survives is about boundary. life and death, above and below, holy and profane, first age and later age, divine order and human administration, memory and forgetting, flood and rebuild, open teaching and hidden archive. That boundary obsession should tell us something. Ancient civilization was not simply curious. It was trying to keep the seams from tearing wider. This becomes clearest when we look at rituals of access. Sealed doors, opened doors, purified entrance, forbidden chambers, restricted books, hidden divine names, initiation rites. The old world was constantly staging the drama of approach. Who may go farther? Who must stop here? Who carries the offering? Who speaks the formula? Who waits outside? These are not only social distinctions, they are models of reality. Existence itself is understood as layered and gated. Later, religious worlds inherit this so thoroughly that it becomes almost invisible. Inner sanctum, clergy, canon, heresy, confession, esoteric teaching, mystical ascent, hidden treasure in a field, sealed revelation to be opened at the appointed time. We continue building around thresholds because ancient memory trained us to suspect that the real pattern lies one chamber deeper than ordinary life. And that center still exerts a pull. A person may go about ordinary life quite comfortably until one object interrupts. A text older than expected, a chamber beneath a sanctuary, a name repeated across cultures, a ritual pattern surviving under different gods, a flood deposit, a king list whose numbers refuse to behave. Then suddenly, history stops feeling past and starts feeling structural. The old fears are not merely old. They are load-bearing. They helped build the categories still sitting inside us. A civilization rises. It preserves something. It loses more than it knows. Later generations rediscover fragments. They mistake some things, understand others, build again, call their recovery new, then bury their own truths for another future. The cycle is not exact. History is too unruly for that, but it is close enough to make old texts feel uncomfortably awake. If you were standing with me now, before one last locked drawer in a museum room gone almost silent for the evening, you might feel that old mixture: scholarly caution, human curiosity, a small childlike excitement, and beneath all of it a gentler fear. What if the next fragment does not merely tell us what ancient people believed? What if it tells us what they noticed? What if they were not only inventing explanations, but preserving observations about recurring structures in human life? Power, collapse, burial, and return. That question is where the darkness of this story becomes calmest and deepest. Because in the end, the buried traces do not only accuse or frighten, they also console in a strange way. They remind us that forgetting is never total, that people before us feared the same erasures and built against them, that hands long vanished still reach us through clay and stone and copied lines. That catastrophe does not always win the whole argument. Sometimes a sealed jar, a hidden chamber, a foundation text, a scribe with discipline, a priest with stubborn memory, a curator with patience, or an excavator with a brush can reopen the conversation. The old world beneath us is not entirely silent. It waits, and when listened to carefully, it still changes the shape of the living world above. In the next movement of the story, that change will begin pressing closer to the present, where the old buried pattern starts looking less like ancient memory and more like a mirror. The mirror begins very quietly. No buried chamber ever climbs the stairs and introduces itself. No tablet clears its throat and says, "Now I will explain your century to you." The movement is slower than that. A scholar notices a repetition. A curator groups objects that should not echo one another so closely. A reader finds the same architecture of fear in widely separated traditions. A ruined foundation resembles a modern institution more than anyone would like. And once that resemblance is seen, it becomes difficult to return to the polite fiction that the ancient world is finished with us. So let us go carefully, because this is the part of the story where the old dust begins to settle on the present. Look around the modern world with the ancient patterns still in your mind. Watch how often we preserve while pretending we are only storing. Watch how often we bury while claiming we are only archiving. Watch how often we rebuild over collapse and then speak as though the ground beneath us were neutral. A city burns records, then spends decades reconstructing identity from surviving fragments. A nation loses confidence in its own foundations, then turns to monuments, constitutions, museums, and anniversaries, as if carefully arranged memory might hold off disintegration. A family keeps one box in the attic that no one opens lightly. A company stores its first documents in climate control and calls it history, when what it really wants is legitimacy. The old instinct has not died. It has learned administrative language. Honestly, one of the strangest things about modernity is how often it copies sacred behavior while insisting on purely practical motives. We build vaults. We limit access. We authenticate relics. We preserve original copies. We fear contamination. We perform ritualized handling. We train specialists in difficult scripts. We elevate founding texts above later commentary. We argue over authorized versions. It is all very rational. Of course. Still, if you stood far enough away, the silhouette would look ancient. That is because the problem has never changed. Human beings do not simply want information. We want continuity. We want proof that the center held once, even if it no longer holds now. We want to know that the things governing us did not emerge yesterday from convenience and panic. We want foundations. And when foundations crack, we begin hunting older ones. This is where buried traces become mirrors. They reveal not only what ancient people feared losing, but what we fear losing still. Authority, memory, identity, legitimacy, access to first things. A correct version hidden under corrupted repetition. The hope that collapse may be survived if only the right fragments are preserved. If you were standing with me in a modern archive reading room, the resemblance would feel almost embarrassing once noticed. Pencils only. No ink. Bags outside. Hands clean. Handle the item gently. Keep the leaves in order. Use the supports provided. Request forms. Identification checked at entry. Silence maintained. The manuscript arrives from a restricted area by the hands of someone authorized. You are allowed to look, but only under rule. That is an old human arrangement. Very old. Knowledge once again behind gates. Then perhaps it must be. Not all gates are sinister. Some exist because fragile things require them. Yet the emotional structure remains familiar. Inside. Outside. Permitted. Deferred. Authorized. Not yet. These phrases travel well across millennia. The deeper unease comes when we recognize that our own age may already be creating the very fragments some future civilization will puzzle over. Hard drives fail. Formats vanish. Languages shift. Institutions collapse. Buildings are repurposed. Context disappears first, then certainty. A future excavator might recover a sealed server room the way we recover a tablet archive. A future reader may hold one surviving printed page from our age and infer systems grander or sadder than the ones we intended. Preservation, for all its dignity, is always partial. That is what makes it both brave and heartbreaking. Ancient people knew this at some level. You can feel it in the urgency of copied texts, in foundation deposits hidden beneath walls, in lists of names, in repeated genealogies, in rebuilding programs that announce restoration even while admitting rupture. They did not preserve because they trusted permanence. They preserved because they did not trust it at all. And if you know that feeling, then you are closer to them than you might wish. Consider how modern people talk after disaster. Not only about rescue and repair, but about records, names, photographs, testimonies, archives, evidence, what must be saved first. Hardly anyone phrases this in sacred language, yet the impulse is sacred in shape. Save the register. Save the list of the dead. Save the founding document. Save the children if you can, and the names if you cannot. Keep enough for return. That phrase could have been understood in an old flood story. This is why catastrophe and archive are secret companions. The archive is created by the expectation of loss, even when the loss has not yet come. A peaceful age may catalog and preserve out of pride. A threatened age preserves out of instinct. It knows, sometimes without saying so, that later generations may need proof that all this once stood. Some scholars argue that this line of thought risks making all preservation feel apocalyptic, and perhaps that is fair. Still, I do not think the old and the modern can be cleanly separated here. The ancient city buried tablets under walls, because walls fall. The modern institution scans manuscripts, because paper burns and decays. The technologies differ. The fear underneath is recognizably related. And fear, when made orderly, becomes infrastructure. That may be one of the most human sentences ever written. You know that feeling when you save something twice, then once more, not because the danger is visible, but because you do not quite trust the world to stay arranged. Ancient people lived inside that feeling on a grand scale. We do too. Only our filing systems are more elaborate and our confidence more theatrical. Let us turn from institutions to the self, because the mirror darkens there. What is memory for a person if not an inner archive? What is trauma if not a sealed chamber that still governs the rooms above it? What is tradition if not a copied text carried in living bodies? What is forgetting if not collapse with survivors? The old mythic pattern of burial and return becomes intimate very quickly when you look at the way a human life stores itself. A child inherits stories without dates, habits without explanation, fears without original scenes. A family preserves one sentence and loses the context around it. A nation repeats a ceremonial phrase after the reason for it has faded. A believer performs a rite older than the theology now used to justify it. A citizen trusts an institution built over ruins whose first foundations were laid in panic generations earlier. Layer over layer, floor above floor, ash below brick, all the archaeology of the self and the group. If you were to excavate a modern life honestly, you would find relics everywhere. Objects kept for reasons that no longer sound fully rational. A ring, a photograph, a letter tied with ribbon, a password known by heart, though rarely used, a family recipe, a childhood prayer never fully discarded, a scar whose origin story has softened, but whose influence remains exact. These are tiny household tablets. They hold identity against erosion. And sometimes, late at night, they speak. Not literally, not in the dramatic way stories like to pretend. More often they speak by rearranging the present around themselves. You find one old thing, a box, a note, a name in a ledger, a birth certificate, a hidden photograph, a receipt in a dead relative's Bible. Suddenly the whole house feels layered. Suddenly time is vertical. The living room above becomes a little less solid because the buried chamber below has opened. That is the ancient sensation again. Discovery not as entertainment, but as destabilization. The old world teaches that whatever is buried is not gone. The modern world keeps relearning this with embarrassment. Lost records resurface. Abused histories return. Silenced testimonies re-enter public speech. Graves are found. Archives are opened. Misattributed works regain their makers. Hidden labor beneath public glory is finally named. The ground gives up its receipts. And when it does, the living must decide what kind of descendants they want to be. There is no easy comfort in that. The past does not come back tidy. It returns damaged, partial, resistant, and morally inconvenient. It asks to be interpreted, yes, but also to be answered. Ancient people knew this too. That is one reason so much old preservation is wrapped in ritual seriousness. To uncover is to assume responsibility. Open the chamber, and now you are part of the chain. Read the tablet, and now you must decide what to do with its warning, its grief, its legitimacy claim, its difficult memory. That responsibility is what makes the mirror most difficult to face. Because if the pattern of preservation, burial, collapse, and partial return is still active, then we are not merely observers of it. We are its current custodians. The sealed thing is in our hands now. The copied text, the damaged memory, the institution built over a break, the inherited right, the uneasy continuity. We are the later generation the buried traces were trying to reach. And what we do next will itself become part of the layer seen from above by someone later. That thought can feel heavy, so let us sit with it gently for a moment. Hear the low museum hum. See the tray under the tablet. Feel the cold of the reading room and the softness of dust on old stone in places not yet catalogued. Think of the patient hands that preserved before us. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough for fragments. Enough for a broken sentence. Enough for a pattern. Enough for us to recognize ourselves in it. That may be the most important word here. Enough. The past rarely survives whole, but enough survives to trouble us, teach us, and sometimes steady us. Enough survives to show that collapse did not erase every careful hand. Enough survives to remind us that human beings, even in frightened ages, still choose to preserve for strangers. Enough survives to make the present less lonely. So before we leave this reading room, notice one last thing. The modern reader almost always believes the danger lies in the content. What does the tablet claim? What hidden doctrine does the inscription preserve? What forgotten scandal does the ledger expose? Yet often the deeper danger lies in the form. The object proves that interruption is survivable. It proves that a culture can be buried and still speak later in pieces. It proves that silence can be a storage phase rather than an ending. Once you understand that, the present begins feeling provisional in a very old way. Your institutions become layers. Your convictions become floors above older floors. Your ordinary life becomes only the latest occupation level in a place where others already built, feared, preserved, and vanished. That realization is not loud, but it is powerful. It lowers the voice. It slows the breathing. It makes you hold things differently. Even a simple page seems less disposable when you remember how many centuries a scratched line on clay once waited to be read again. And that, perhaps, is how the old traces keep doing their work, not by shouting revelations, but by changing the weight of the present in your hands. And in the final part, we will let that loneliness and that continuity settle together, where the buried world, the living world, and the one still to come meet in a single hush. Now we come to the hush that follows recognition. Not the hush of fear exactly, though fear has walked beside us. Not the hush of certainty either, because certainty is almost never granted in these matters. This is a different stillness, the kind that arrives when scattered fragments begin forming a pattern just strong enough to alter the heart, but not so strong that mystery is banished. The buried world remains partly buried. The present remains partly blind. Yet a line has been drawn between them, and once drawn, it cannot be politely unseen. So let us sit for a while in that line. The old civilizations we have followed into hidden rooms and sealed archives are gone in the obvious sense. Their kings have lost their breath. Their temple fires are ash. Their languages survive through specialists, dictionaries, cracked grammar charts, and the stubborn patience of readers. Their roads are interrupted. Their walls are quarries for later houses. Their gods drift through museums under borrowed light. If you judged only by surface, you might say they lost everything. And still, they did not lose the final argument, because here you are, long after their cities collapsed, listening to what they feared, what they counted, what they hid, what they tried to carry across catastrophe. The chain held badly, imperfectly, with knots and breaks and missing lengths. But it held enough. That word returns again because it matters. Enough memory. Enough stone. Enough ink. Enough clay. Enough names. Enough ritual logic. Enough care. Enough future curiosity. Enough mercy from weather, soil, war, theft, and neglect that the old world could whisper forward through time instead of vanishing into mute dust. There is something deeply calming in that, even though the material itself can be dark. Catastrophe happened. Empires broke. Floods came. Kingdoms shortened. Sacred centers shifted. What people loved was buried. What people trusted was damaged. But the human answer, again and again, was not only grief. It was preservation. Place the text beneath the wall. Seal the chamber. Copy the list. Carve the name. Tell the child. Repair the rite. Store the relic. Mark the grave. Write it again more carefully. Hide it better this time. Civilization can be understood as many things, but at midnight, in the softer part of thought, I suspect it is often this: a long cooperative attempt to keep some fragile and necessary things from being lost all at once. If you were with me now, we would not be in the museum any longer. We would have stepped outside. Night air. Stone steps cooling underfoot. Perhaps a little rain smell in the distance. The city around us still awake in places, but gentler. And behind the walls we just left, box after box, tray after tray, shelf after shelf, the old worlds would remain in their managed dark, not dead exactly, not alive exactly, but waiting in that patient category archives know so well. Waiting is one of the great themes of buried history. A text waits for the right language to return. A tomb waits for a future shovel. A family story waits for one person to ask the proper question. A damaged institution waits for its forgotten foundation to be named. A people waits for records that prove what they already carried in memory. Even grief waits. It settles into objects and corners until some later touch brings it back into voice. Perhaps that is why ruins can feel kinder at night than by day. Daylight asks what stood here and why it fell. Night asks who remembered and what survived. The first question is necessary. The second is merciful. Some scholars would rightly remind us that survival is uneven, that the archive is not innocent, that many voices were never preserved with equal care. Yes, that truth must remain with us. Preservation has always favored power in one direction and chance in another. For every king list saved, countless ordinary names were lost. For every sealed chamber kept dry, some whole library was burned. For every ritual copied, another fell silent. The past that reaches us is not complete. It is biased, damaged, and often unjust in its distribution of survival. And yet, even that damaged survival can be turned toward honesty. A broken archive may still reveal the shape of what was excluded. A silence in the record can speak when placed beside an abundance elsewhere. An inventory that objectifies can still expose the system that wrote it. A burial stripped of goods can still testify to rank, violence, poverty, or hest. Fragments are not fair, but they are not useless. In careful hands, even their incompleteness becomes evidence. That is another form of tenderness. To listen responsibly to what survives without pretending it is all that once existed. The ancient world, in its best moments, knew something similar. It often preserved an awareness of prior loss. This temple stands where another fell. This text is copied from an older, damaged version. This king restores what enemies ruined. This rite continues from before the flood. Continuity itself was often presented through the admission of interruption. I think that is one reason the old voices still feel trustworthy at times. They do not always hide the break. They build across it in public. There is wisdom in that for any later age. We do not calm ourselves by pretending collapse never happened. We calm ourselves by learning how humans carried meaning through it. The hidden chamber is not proof that the world is safe. It is proof that people knew it was not safe and still chose care over surrender. You know that feeling when you find something small from long ago and the sheer fact of its survival changes your breathing a little. A recipe card in an old kitchen drawer. A penciled note in the margin of a book. A name cut into wood. A box of photographs held together by a ribbon now almost brittle. For a second, the whole machinery of loss pauses, not because death has been beaten, but because attention has bridged the gap. That is what these older civilizations still offer us. Not immortality. Bridging. A bridge between the first maker and the later finder. Between catastrophe and return. Between what was hidden and what is finally named. Between the one who buried a text and the one who opens it. Between forgetting and enough memory. The more I think about it, the more that seems to be the real counterweight to the darkness in this story. Hidden knowledge can be unsettling. Buried traces can accuse the living. Archives can expose the fragility of all institutions. Yes, but they also reveal that human beings have always worked on behalf of strangers they would never meet. Every preserved line is an act of trust in the future. Every copied tablet says, someone later may need this. Every sealed deposit says, if the walls fall, let something remain to speak. And here you are, the later someone. That does not make you important in a grand theatrical sense. It makes you responsible in a quiet one. To read carefully. To hold gently. To resist flattening the old world into either fantasy or irrelevance. To let the dead keep some of their dignity and complexity. To carry forward what can be carried without claiming more certainty than the evidence allows. To preserve, in your own way, for another stranger beyond you. That final motion may be the most ancient of all. One generation receiving fragments, living among ruins, whether visible or hidden, making what sense it can, then setting aside some careful record for those not yet born. It is not glamorous work. Scribes knew that. Curators know it. Parents know it. Anyone who labels, stores, copies, teaches, repairs, or tells a story one more time before sleep knows it too. Outside, the night deepens a little more. Inside the vaults, the clay remains cool. In houses and archives and memory itself, the buried layers remain where they are, not inert, not fully active, but available. That availability is almost enough to call hope, though hope may be too bright a word. Let us call it steadiness instead. The steadiness of knowing that not everything vanishes at once. The steadiness of knowing that meaning can survive in partial form. The steadiness of knowing that even after flood, fire, conquest, forgetting, and silence, a voice may still reach forward and be met by another voice willing to listen. So if the story has grown dark, let it grow soft too. Think of the dust not only as burial, but as padding around what was saved. Think of the stone not only as ruin, but as shelter for inscriptions. Think of the hidden chamber not only as secrecy, but as care under pressure. Think of the archive not only as a vault, but as a promise. Think of the old world not only as lost, but as patient. And think of yourself, for this final moment, not as someone standing outside history looking in, but as one more quiet keeper moving through the layer assigned to you. You inherit fragments. You add your own. You misread some things. You understand others more clearly than those before you could. You protect what you can. You fail in places. You pass something onward anyway. That is enough. More than enough, perhaps. It is the oldest human duty wearing one of its simpler faces. The buried cities sleep. The tablets wait. The names endure where they can. The hidden traces remain underfoot, under stone, under habit, under language, under the ordinary rooms of living people who suspect, every now and then, that the floor is deeper than it looks. And perhaps that suspicion is not a curse. Perhaps it is a kind of companionship. The dead are not pressing upward to drag us down. Often they are simply leaving the lamp lit in the lower room, so that when our own century feels uncertain, we can descend a few careful steps, look around, and remember that others also lived through fracture, carried what they could, and entrusted their fragments to the future. The conversation was never finished. It was only buried for a while. Rest now. Let the archive close. Let the vault doors hold. Let the dust settle where it wishes. Let the old kings remain in their lists. Let the broken temples keep their measurements. Let the copied names continue their quiet work. Let the living world above grow dim and gentle. And if somewhere beneath it all, a patient record still waits for another hand, another century, another careful reader, that is all right too. For tonight, it is enough to know that the buried world has spoken, and that you listened. Before we end completely, hold one last image. Not a throne room, not a floodplain, not a museum shelf, just a single person in lamplight, very long ago, leaning over wet clay. Their wrist turns. The stylus presses. A wedge appears, then another. Outside, a city is alive with all the ordinary sounds cities make when they still believe tomorrow will resemble today. Inside, this one person copies carefully, anyway. Name after name. offering after offering. A warning, a dedication, a line from an older source already damaged. They cannot know the empire that will rise next, or the fire, or the burial, or the centuries of silence. They can only make the marks cleanly and trust that careful work is a form of kindness. That image steadies me. It reminds me that preservation is not only institutional. It begins in one pair of hands, deciding to be accurate while the world remains uncertain. The hidden trace starts there, in patience, before it ever becomes archaeology, scholarship, or legend. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson buried history offers. Do the careful work anyway. Keep the record. Tend the fire. Copy the line. Store the fragment. Teach the name. Leave enough for someone later. Good night.